Okay, so I just want to be clear that when we're talking about this argument that Paulogia is making this video, that he, from our understanding, is addressing Gary Habermas and his minimal facts. So Gary Habermas says that there are certain things that are agreed upon by virtually all scholars or a high majority of scholars. So things like that the early Christians were martyred, I think, is a fact, and that they said that Jesus Christ rose from the dead is, I think, one of the minimal facts. So there's like 4 to 7 minimal facts that Gary Habermas is saying, and he says that he can use these minimal facts to essentially show that the resurrection is the best explanation of these facts. And so Paulogia is responding to that argument in this video. But what we are going to be doing is we're going to be showing that even if Paulogia is accounting for these minimal facts, he's not necessarily accounting for all the relevant facts. So it's one thing to account for minimal facts, and these are just facts that are widely agreed upon, but there are other facts that we would say are also relevant in addition to these, which Paulogia's theory is not going to account for whatsoever. So we're not necessarily addressing Paulogia and his argument to Gary Habermas. We're kind of showing we might touch on just the minimal facts, but we're showing that this theory really doesn't account for all the relevant facts. Would you agree with that, Nathan?
Yeah, exactly. And in his most recent tome on the subject on the resurrection, he's releasing his magnum opus. And I think his minimal facts as of right now are: number one, Jesus was crucified; number two, the apostles had experiences that they interpreted as Jesus being risen from the dead; three, they started preaching about the resurrection of Jesus pretty early after the crucifixion. I want to say number four is the conversion of Paul. Number five is the conversion of James. I might be missing one, but that's all off the top of my head. So Paulogia is basically framing this theory that he has as a response to these facts. And so that's kind of the idea, is he's responding to Habermas. And what we're saying is he's not, he might technically, in a very technical sense, be fulfilling Gary Habermas's minimal facts. However, he's not accounting for all of the relevant facts. And I also just want to say, I think he kind of assumes some things that we're going to get into in just a moment. There are some presuppositions underlying his position that I think are really going to be difficult to get off the ground if we push them and pressure them. Hello and welcome to the Epitome. I'm your host, Nathan Bozeman. Today, we're going to be doing a response to Paulogia, and I'm bringing on a very special guest, my friend Darwin to Jesus. How are you doing today, man?
I'm doing wonderful, Nathan. How are you? It's wonderful to be here.
Yeah, man, I think this is going to be a lot of fun. And I was thinking before we get started, I wanted to talk a little bit about who you are. If maybe someone in my audience doesn't know who you are, could you maybe introduce yourself and tell us where they can find you and things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like you said, I'm Darwin to Jesus. I do have a small YouTube channel of about 1,400 subscribers right now. I'm trying to grow it, but making videos is a lot of work, which I think you know better than even I do. So, primarily, I spend time over at X, and I'm a former atheist turned Christian, and I love talking to atheists. I have a burden for atheists. So, mostly what I do is I make memes and arguments that argue against atheism and for Christianity. And I do that in order to both bring atheists over to Christianity and also to help Christians feel bold in their faith.
Yeah, and I really enjoy your memes, by the way. So definitely go give him a follow. I'll put a link in the description below to his YouTube channel and to his X account so that you guys can check that out. But as I said earlier, we're going to be doing a response to Paulogia today on his argument for the resurrection that he did about 6 years ago, and we're going to be. I'll be adding context along the way because I know he's updated it over the years, and we'll be talking a little bit through all of that. But we wanted to respond and talk about why we think his resurrection argument doesn't work. Before we do that, do you have any comments about this video or any preliminary remarks you want to make, Daniel?
No, I don't think so. I think that once we get going with the video, the problems are going to become very obvious very quickly. But I just want to say I am definitely looking forward to talking about it because I think that this is an important argument that's being made against Christianity and needs to be addressed. Even if Paulogia is not strictly speaking a scholar, this is still an argument that he's making, trying to minimize the facts of the resurrection. And so I'm really looking forward to debunking this video.
Yeah, I agree. And I will say personally, I think this is the best atheist attempt on the internet to answer Gary Habermas's minimal facts case. So I do think that more people need to, address this argument. So I'm happy to do that today. But before we start watching the video, I have a quick presentation I want to give. It should just take a few minutes to talk about a couple of presuppositions that I think Paulogia brings into his videos and into his arguments that I believe if those presuppositions are false, his argument cannot even get off the ground. So we're going to begin with this. So we're going to respond to Paulogia on the resurrection. So the purpose of this short presentation is to flag two of Paulogia's presuppositions that his case against the resurrection heavily relies upon. I believe his case cannot get off the ground if these presuppositions are false. The first one is that the Gospels are informal and uncontrolled traditions. So I'll explain what this means. Basically, an informal and uncontrolled tradition simply means that there is no one at the top of the tradition who is making sure that different embellishments and ahistorical details are being brought into the mix. And basically, it's being spread like gossip. That's the uncontrolled part. Essentially, I heard this story and then I go tell my friend, and then they go tell their friend, and then they go tell their friend. And then essentially, he believes that the Gospels got written down after that long chain of telephone game, basically. And so now we have the Gospels, which are kind of a shell of what they used to be. And like maybe there was some nuggets of truth in the beginning, but as the story spread and grew over time, it just got bigger and bigger and more ahistorical. And so basically, we're left with no resurrection. Like that's just a part of the myth, as he would put it. So that's what an uncontrolled informal tradition means. And so basically, if this is not true, I think Paulogia's case is going to be very, very difficult to get off the ground. So I want to defend the Gospels as rather formal, controlled traditions. So basically the exact opposite of what Paulogia thinks. So the first line of evidence I want to give for this is the Creed in 1 Corinthians 15. So the letter of 1 Corinthians dates to about 52 AD. However, there's a Creed in 1 Corinthians 15, and basically this Creed dates to the 30s, according to most scholars. And so this is very early attestation. And basically, it mentions the burial of Jesus and it mentions the post resurrection appearances. And the important thing here is that this is consistent with what the Gospels say. So even if we grant the skeptics the decades and decades of transmission, if we even say Mark is written in the 70s and Matthew and Luke in the 80s and John in the 90s, even if we give skeptics all the dates they want, they're still going to have this issue that there's a creed in the 30s that is identical or very similar to what the Gospels say in the grand narrative of the story that shows that there was not this growing ahistorical mythological element over time because their stories are consistent.
Nathan, can I interrupt you for a second? So, did you say what that creed actually says?
No, I can read it for us if we
I think
want.
that would be really helpful so that everyone knows exactly what that creed says and why it's very relevant to this conversation.
Sure, I'll read it from the NIV just to make sure it's like understandable for everyone. So it's verses 3 through 10, I believe. So he says this: For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried. So there's the burial, that he was raised from the dead on the third day. So we have the death and resurrection, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. And after that, more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still living. So we have, I'll stop reading for a second. We have appearances to Peter, that's who Cephas is. And then we have another appearance to the 12. And then we have another appearance to 500. Now we'll keep going. And he also says most of them are still living. So he's basically saying, like, go check, bro. Like, these people are still alive. You can talk to them. Then he says, then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. and last of all, he appeared to me as one untimely born. So then we have an appearance to James, and then another group appearance to all the apostles. So this is a very, very early creed that Paul had received, and this dates back to the 30s. And so again, it's very consistent with what we see in the gospel. So skeptics, even if we give them a late date, even if we say the gospels are decades and decades later, they're going to have to explain how the gospels are just adding mythological elements over time when something so early matches what they say. Did that make sense, Daniel?
Yeah, yeah, that absolutely makes sense. And it's a very, very good piece of evidence in refuting what Paulogia is going to try to say, because he's going to try to make this case that, well, things got embellished, things changed over time, and many years later, like decades and decades, then these gospels are written anonymously, and then we get these highfalutin claims. But this creed, which we do find in the New Testament, but which dates from within 3 months to 3 years. That's where it's typically dated, 3 months to 3 years. Even by secular scholars, they've dated it that early. This very early creed, from 3 months to 3 years from the death of Christ and his resurrection, I would argue, says exactly what Christians still today believe, which is that Jesus died for our sins and that he rose from the grave. He was buried and rose from the grave. So this the whole point of this is that it completely invalidates the argument about the New Testament being coming much later, because we've got this creed that's dated so early. So I hope that everybody understands what a crucial point that is.
Yes. And also, it flows perfectly into our next point here. The teaching of Jesus and his followers contradicts the idea that this is growing over time. So I'll explain what I mean here. So Jesus taught in what is called kriya. This is a Greek word, and all it means is a useful anecdote. And so essentially, what a kriya is the apostles and Jesus and philosophers at the time, they would tell you these teachings and they would format them in a way that they were easily memorizable and they were easy to remember. That way, if someone heard it and was listening, they themselves could go and report it kind of accurately. And so, if you look in the parables of Jesus, or if you look in the teachings of Jesus in the Gospels, what you'll see is they use a lot of alliteration, hyperbole, rhyming, things like this in order to make sure that his teachings are easy to memorize. And Eusebius, who's our earliest church historian, he actually attests to Peter preaching in Kriya as well, or Kriya. And so our earliest testimonies from the early church says that Jesus taught in Kriya, Peter taught in Kriya, and then Luke and Paul. So Luke in chapter 1 of his uh, gospel, in his preface, he says that he uses this word, he receives a tradition from those that were eyewitnesses from the beginning. And then Paul as well, kind of like this creed in 1 Corinthians 15, he's passing on and receiving memorized traditions that have been passed on and cultivated. He has another one in 1 Corinthians 11, I believe it is, where he talks about the Lord's Supper, and he essentially quotes Luke verbatim in that letter as well. So very interesting that we see in both the Gospels and in Paul's letters memorized traditions. So again, this points to formal controlled traditions where we have it's formal in the sense that it's keeping its form. It's not being taken and growing over time. It's actually being performed in memorizable, short, anecdotes, and controlled. All that means is that there are authoritative witnesses at the top who are making sure that it's not growing over time, and we'll show evidence for that in a moment. So right now we're kind of dealing with the uncontrolled part, because the uncontrolled part would allow for lots of myth to grow and grow and grow over time. And then in a moment, we're going to deal with formal. So these two lines of evidence are going to be evidence for the idea that it's a controlled tradition. So it's not growing over time. We have a consistent message from the 30s all the way to however late the skeptics want to date the Gospels. And then we have short, memorizable traditions being passed down that are cultivated over time and are not cultivated in the sense that they're growing, but cultivated in the sense that they are being solidified and like not changing at all. Now, we're again going to go to the formal side of it as well as the controlled. So this one right here is going to deal with both. So Matthew and Luke, it's pretty consistent in scholarship that they use Mark as a source. So Mark was written first, according to most scholars, and then later on, Matthew and Luke use Mark as a source. And what's interesting about their use of Mark as a source is that they're more conservative with Mark than Josephus is with the Old Testament. So what this shows is that these early Christians are not viewing these traditions as something that is able to be grown. It's not malleable. It's not something that you can just add on to willy nilly. They are being often verbatim with Mark. A lot of times they're sharing things word for word with Mark. And so what this shows is that Matthew and Luke, first of all, viewed Mark's testimony very highly, which is going to be hard to explain on the anonymous gospel hypothesis, which we're going to get to in a moment. But because I don't know how you can explain Mark being used by other sources if he was just written by some random guy. But that'll be something we argue in a moment. But at the same time, the consistency and how conservative they are with the content, I think that this points away from the idea that the tradition is just growing and growing over time without care. And then finally,
Hey, Nathan,
we're gonna
quick,
yeah.
would you mind explaining what Josephus does with the Old Testament? Because I'm not familiar with that, and I can pretty much guarantee almost no listener is going to be familiar with that.
Sure. So essentially, there are ideas called midrashic, like uh, expositions, which is like a very, I guess, technical term. But basically, what they do is they take Old Testament passages and they'll either quote it or they'll reference it, but he will change like some of the wording or he'll interpret it in a weird way. I don't have specific examples off the top of my head, but what I could say is that essentially he changes the Old Testament whenever he's referencing it or quoting it way more than Matthew and Luke do whenever they are referencing Mark as a source. So,
So I think I understand your point. Is your point that Josephus is thought by many people to be a good historian, and he changed the Old Testament, what he's reading there, far more than the gospel authors like Luke and Matthew changed Mark. So if Josephus is thought to be reliable, then we should think that Matthew and Luke are even more reliable. Is that right?
yeah, and we should also think that they viewed Mark as reliable, which is
Of
really
course.
important too.
Absolutely.
They viewed Mark as a reliable source because these guys are writing biographies, and so when biographers are writing a biography, what do they want to do? They want to use reliable sources, and Mark is being viewed as a reliable source here. But also, crucially, on top of what you just said, it's also not just that Josephus is a reliable historian; it's also that Josephus is Jewish. And so he should have high regard for the Old Testament. And so the fact that he is allowed to change the Old Testament in that way, like there's some allowable variation when referencing the Old Testament, it shows that Matthew and Luke are even holding Mark in higher regard. It's like, no, we're not changing this at all,
Yeah,
right?
because
Even
they're
though
all
that was
Jewish.
considered allowable.
Because
Right.
they're all Jewish, right?
Yeah.
Well, I guess Luke wasn't, but
Actually, what's interesting is I've seen some scholars try to argue recently that Luke might have been Jewish, but I don't know how true that is. But it's just an interesting point. Um, but moving on to Papias, because this is going to get into the formal aspect of it. So Papias is our earliest attestation to the authorship of Matthew and Mark, but he's also got some really interesting some quotes where he mentions how he wants to speak to only authoritative witnesses. And so basically, what he does, he says in his writings, is that whenever someone comes into his town that knew Matthew or knew Mark or knew Luke or any of the disciples, he wants to talk to them. He basically says, I only want information if you've spoken to the disciples yourselves or their followers. So he mentions these two guys named John the Elder and Aristion, and he says these guys are still alive today during his time, and he wanted to speak to them directly, or he wanted to speak to anyone who knew the disciples personally. And so what this points to is that the earliest Christians, this is the earliest Christian attestation we have. What are they not doing? They're not accepting hearsay. They're not accepting uncontrolled traditions that have been growing like gossip over time, but rather they're only accepting information from guarantors or like authoritative witnesses of the tradition. And so basically the idea that the gospels are uncontrolled, there's no authoritative witnesses at the top, it's growing over time mythologically. It just does not stand up with the data at all. Do you have any comments on that, Daniel?
Well, I actually have about 5 reasons why I think that we should think that the Gospels were controlled and why we know exactly who wrote them. I can go through
Mhm.
them very quickly if you'd like.
Yeah, sure. Go for it.
Okay, so because I do think that this is crucial that even if we say that the Gospels are anonymous, we still have that creed, but we do rely on the Gospels for other parts of his argument, like the empty tomb in a few
Hmm.
places and other things. So it is important, I think, to say that we know who wrote the Gospels and that we can trust their witness. So
Hmm.
the first reason is that anonymous authorship is absurd. And what I mean by that is that the idea that these churches would just accept some kind of anonymous document and preach from it is really insulting to Christians, that they're just going to be like, oh, who wrote this? And nobody knows. And then they're just going to start teaching from it as if it's scripture. I think that that makes no sense whatsoever. And that theory is just absurd. I mean, imagine manuscript shows up or an autograph, meaning that here's an original gospel, and it just shows up on the porch of one of these early churches, these early church communities, and they're like, "Where'd this come from?" And nobody knows. And then they're like, "Well, it seems to talk about Jesus, so let's just teach out of it, start making a bunch of copies and send it everywhere." That's not what would happen, And the
Yeah.
suggestion that it would is frankly insulting. So that's the first reason.
And
The second
also,
reason.
just to piggyback on that as well, you have because I think that skeptics are going to have to answer the question: why did they find these writings authoritative? Right, like that's what you're getting at. Why did these writings get received as authoritative and no others? Because and here's the thing: it goes against the Gnostic Gospels never being received, like the Gospel of Peter, Gospel of Thomas. These documents talk about Jesus, and they were never received as canon. So I think they're going to have a really hard time, kind of like you're saying, wrestling with the idea that early Christians were totally cool receiving these anonymous documents that no one knew who wrote them. But when it came to these like later documents, like they weren't. And what's funny is if you look at their explicit reasoning for not accepting them, they say, oh, it's because they're not from the actual sources. They say, like, their reasoning is, we know who wrote these and we don't know who wrote these. Right.
Right.
So,
And
yeah.
that is
Anyways.
exactly what you would expect for people that care about the truth and are willing to die for it. That's
Yeah.
how stringent you would expect them to be,
Hmm.
frankly
Exactly.
speaking. The next reason is that the New Testament Gospels contain undesigned coincidences. And Nathan, you know more about this than I do, but I do know that there are many undesigned coincidences within the Gospels. And what I mean by that is that there are various places where one Gospel will raise a question without thinking about it, but you can ask a question about what it says. And that question will be inadvertently answered by another Gospel.
Hmm.
So one gospel might say one thing, and you might think to yourself, well, why is that happening? And then another gospel will just kind of answer it without directly referencing it or anything like that. And you'll get that information that you need from another gospel. And there are a bunch of these. I don't know if you want to give a specific example of that, Nathan, but the point that I'm raising here is that if there are these undesigned coincidences, that strongly suggests actual eyewitness accounts because you would not expect to see undesigned coincidences if these were just elaborations or basically embellishments, and if it was just myth, and legend and that sort of thing, you would not expect to see the Gospels harmonizing and corroborating information with each other in the way that they do. It sounds very much more like these are actual eyewitness accounts.
Yeah. So, one quick example, it's probably the easiest one for me to remember off the top of my head is why did Jesus ask, uh, oh man, is it Philip? Yeah, he asked Philip
Yes.
for bread. Sorry, that I completely forgot which one he asked. So he asks Philip in John chapter 6, where do we find bread? And they're and Philip has no lines. He doesn't say anything in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. So he's literally hasn't ever uttered a sentence in any of the gospels. And then randomly in John, Jesus looks at Philip and says, hey, where do we find bread? And so you might naturally ask the question, why did he ask Philip? This guy that we don't know basically anything about if you read the rest of the Gospels. And if you look in the Gospel of Luke, you'll see that the feeding of the 5,000 is located in Bethsaida. Okay. And so it's just a casual comment that is thrown into Luke. Hey, they approach a city named Bethsaida. And then they go on and they keep talking about the feeding of the 5,000. And it's important to note as well that Luke is written before John. So this detail already existed before John's writing. And then when you go back to the Gospel of John and you look in chapter 1, you'll see that Philip is from Bethsaida. And so now it makes sense. But you have to go to 3 different contexts to answer the question, why did Jesus ask Philip, where do we find bread? It's because they were in Bethsaida and Philip was from there.
Which you find out from 3 different gospels, I believe, at least 2.
2.
Yep, absolutely. So
Yep.
the next reason, so I've given 2 reasons so far. The next reason is that the gospels have strange authorship. If we were to assume, very uncharitably, that the early Christians were just accepting documents when they had no idea who the author was, it's very strange that they would have attributed these gospels to these specific men, because Matthew was a tax collector. So if you're going to say, we got this gospel and it's authoritative and we're going to preach from it, would you really have chosen the tax collector and say that he wrote it? Would you have said that Mark wrote a gospel? Because Mark wasn't even one of the eyewitnesses to these events. He was a companion of Peter. And then Luke was a companion of Paul. So you've got Mark and Luke, who were not even Jesus's original disciples. These are not the 12 apostles. Why would you say that they wrote these authoritative gospels? That doesn't make sense. The only one that makes sense is John, because John was a very esteemed apostle of Christ. So that one makes sense. But the other 3, you would say, you would expect the if they're just going to name these gospels and say, this guy, oh yeah, this guy wrote it because we want it to be authoritative, you would expect them to say Peter wrote it, or the main apostles, the main ones that you think of. You wouldn't expect Matthew. You definitely would not expect Mark or Luke. So if we're
Especially
going to,
since Matthew, just wanted to say, especially since Matthew is writing his gospel primarily to the Jewish people, tax collectors were considered like betraying the Jews. They were considered like, you betrayed us, we don't like you, right? So think about who he's writing to and who he was. Like, he was a tax collector and he's writing to the Jews, people that they would have considered him a traitor. That makes no sense. So yeah.
yeah. The 4th reason is that the early church fathers all agreed on gospel authorship. So every time we see an early church father say, oh, this person wrote the Gospel of Luke, they say Luke wrote Luke. Every time they talk about who wrote the Gospels, they're always agreed. And that's really strange, because when it comes to the book of Hebrews, we don't know who wrote the book of Hebrews, and we don't know because they didn't know. And they didn't know, and they said that they didn't know, and they argued about it. So here in this case, where we have something that seems like an anonymous work, we can tell very quickly that it is anonymous, because there's no agreement even within them, within the early church fathers, about who wrote the book of Hebrews. But when it comes to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we never see any disagreement whatsoever. All of them knew exactly who wrote those gospels. And that's exactly what we would expect, because those gospels were the foundation of the church. Those gospels were taught from as authoritative. So, of course, the early Christians would know exactly where they came from, and that wouldn't be forgotten anytime soon. And it still hasn't been forgotten all the way until now. We still know. So that's the 4th reason. I don't know if you want to say anything about that, Nathan. I've got one more.
Yeah.
The
I'll just say as well, I just remembered in my next part of the presentation was going to be about us knowing who the gospel authorship are. And I think this is an important one that I have on here too. The debate about Hebrews is like, there's an absence of debates on Hebrews, which is really interesting when you think about how unanimous the attestation is on the Gospels. It's a really important point, and I don't think it's given enough credit by the skeptics. So I'll just skip ahead to this slide so they can see kind of the stuff I have here too. And then the last one for you.
Yeah, so the last one, this is reason number 5, is that the earliest manuscripts all name their authors. So every time we see a manuscript with a name on it, meaning that here's the front cover and it says who wrote the manuscript or where it comes from, we always see the exact same name. So we never get the Gospel of Matthew and it says on the top, this was written by John or this was written by Peter or something like that. Every time we find a manuscript with a front cover on it or the first page on it, it always attributes that gospel to the gospels or to the authors that we believe today wrote that gospel. All right. And that's really significant because the analogy that I give is imagine that Stephen King, all of his books, they don't say in the text that he wrote it. Nowhere within the book themselves does it say, I'm Stephen King and I wrote this, right? Inside
Yeah.
the book, it doesn't say it. But the cover says that he's the author. So imagine in 2,000 years, a lot of those books are going to be really old. We're going to be missing a lot of covers. But imagine if every single time we did find one of his books, and on the cover, if it did have a cover, every time we find a book with a cover, it says Stephen King wrote this. Would we question, I wonder who wrote this? Or would we be like, well, the author is obviously Stephen King. And that's what we see with the Gospels. Every time we have a Gospel with the front cover, it always says Matthew wrote it, or it always says John wrote it, every single time. So that's the
Mhm.
fifth reason.
Yeah, and that gets right into this distinction here, internal versus external anonymity. So, what internal anonymity refers to is that the gospel authors never say, like, "Hi, I'm Matthew, and I'm writing this gospel," or "Me, John, I'm writing this to you." They never internally identify themselves, and no one is disputing this. The gospels are internally anonymous. However, this does not mean that no one knew who wrote them or that they were treated as anonymous by those who received them. This to me is super important because there is a distinction between a document being treated as anonymous and maybe cited without being or quoted without being cited. So let me explain this distinction because it's really important. Because some more um, adept skeptics that have been in this space for a while might be sitting here thinking about Justin Martyr or First Clement and documents like this or the Didache where they say something like according to the gospel of the Lord, and then they'll quote the gospel of Matthew, or according to the gospel, and then they'll quote the gospel of Luke or something like this. And they'll say, see, they're quoting Matthew, and they didn't say it was by Matthew. They said it was called the gospel of the Lord. And so it was anonymous. So this is a very, very important point because this distinction is what really matters here. They are citing a source without, or they're quoting a source rather without citing who wrote it. However, they're not treating it as anonymous. Those are not the same thing. And we know this because Irenaeus in 180 AD and against heresies or 185, he does both. He does the exact same thing. He quotes Matthew and Luke and calls it according to the gospel of the Lord, and in the exact same book names all four authors. And so we see in that very book that that is something that is a genuine distinction. They would cite these works as um, without necessarily, or they would quote the work. I keep mixing up my distinctions. Sorry about that. They quote the work without citing who the author is. However, they're not treating them as anonymous. And I don't even think Justin Martyr or First Clement or any of these guys are too. And this kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier. It's an insult to early Christians to say that they are going to just receive anonymous documents and treat them as authoritative without actually knowing who wrote them. And also, Justin Martyr calls them the memoirs of the apostles, which that word memoir in the Greek means memories or remembrances. And so he's not treating these documents as anonymous. He's saying these are the memories of the apostles. We know what these documents are. And he even references the memoirs of Peter and references something that specifically happens in Mark. And according to testimony, Mark is the remembrances of Peter. So that lines up perfectly with our other testimony. So I think it's really, really important to understand that you can quote a source without citing it, but still not treat it as an anonymous document. Really, really important distinction there, which this is, by the way, the second presupposition that I think Paulogia's case cannot get off the ground if it's false. He treats the Gospels as anonymous. He treats the Gospels as we don't know who wrote them. The tradition grew and grew and grew and passed on like the telephone game. And then eventually everything was written down by these guys that never knew Jesus, never knew Peter, never knew the disciples. And that's what the Gospels are. And so it's not a historical it's not a historically reliable resource per se about the life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus, but rather it's just the myth that grew over decades. And so, really important there. So, because you went through all your reasons, I'm only going to mention things you haven't mentioned to end this off, and then we'll get into Paulogia's video.
Can I say one other thing real quick?
Yeah,
So
sure, go for it.
so I want to say that Paulogia is not just saying that the gospels are anonymous. He's also saying that what the gospels are saying is not true. Because if even if the gospels are anonymous, if what they say is true, then Paulogia still has a lot more to account for. So he's trying to say that the gospels are also false, and he's trying to say that we should think that they're false because they're anonymous. But that's also something that he's assuming, is that the gospels are also false, and someone can write something and have it be anonymous and it could be true. So I just want to highlight, he's also assuming that what the gospels say is false, and that's why he's not going to account for what they say because of that assumption.
Yes. And he also, I think it's important to note, he does try to say that this is only a response to Gary Habermas. So he kind of frames this as he's only responding to Gary Habermas's minimal facts. And so he doesn't view gospel reliability as a fact to be explained. And so to him, he doesn't have to account for everything the gospels say because he's only trying to account for Habermas's facts. And so I do think that's an important thing to note as we respond, that in Paulogia's mind, he does not think he has to account for everything in the gospels because gospel reliability is not one of Habermas's facts to like minimal facts. Like it's not like Jesus was crucified, the gospels are reliable, the tomb is empty, etc. The gospel reliability is not one of those facts. So he rejects gospel reliability and he says, well, that's not one of his facts, so I don't have to explain that. Just to help people understand that too. So you already went through the manuscript evidence. Again, all the manuscripts with titles on them, have the names we have on them today. There's unbroken attestation. This is important because Augustine has this quote where he says, the way that we know who wrote a lot of works is because of the unbroken chain of attestation. And it's widespread too. If you look on a map and you see where all these people that are attesting to the different authors are living, it's a very, very wide geographical range. And you got to remember, they didn't have Google, they didn't have Wikipedia, they didn't have libraries, they didn't have cars and internet. Like a lot of people don't realize how difficult this is to get right, that they're in complete unanimity all over the world, basically, or all over the Roman Empire on who wrote these things. And then finally, I also think that these two, you mentioned undesigned coincidences. So I'll say there's two other phenomena I want to look at. One is onomastic congruence, which all that means is that the name data in the Gospels are aligned with the name data of first century Judea, which is really, really important because if you go outside of Judea, the name statistics completely change. And so there was Luke Vandewey, they recently did a study on this, and they showed that if the Gospels, are representative of the time that they were written, then it was like an 87% chance or something crazy. I'm doing that off the top of my head, so if my percentages are slightly off, forgive me. But it was a really insanely high percent chance that basically the Gospels were written in the first century and in Judea. And they compared that to Josephus, and it wasn't even close. Josephus had I want to say less than 10% chance of being in first century Judea, and that is where he was. So it's kind of mind boggling how much higher the onomastic congruence of the Gospels are than even Josephus. And then finally, author idiosyncrasies. This is one of my favorite ones. Matthew, we know he's a tax collector. Matthew mentions money more than any other gospel, much more. And he's the only one that keeps track of things like Judas, whenever he betrayed Jesus, he, purchased land. Matthew is the only one that mentions that. He also has the story with the temple tax with Jesus and Peter, where they have to pay the temple tax. And he actually references a specific coin that is exactly what would have paid their taxes. Pretty interesting. And things like this. And so whenever we look at the external corroboration, everyone's saying, this is from Matthew, the tax collector. And then we look inside the Gospel of Matthew and we see this focus on money. It lines up perfectly. And then when we look at Luke, He is a physician, he's a doctor according to tradition. And then when we look at the healing narratives in Luke, he always gives more details than the other gospel authors. And again, this is just the kind of thing you would expect from a doctor. Or with John, he's a fisherman, and so there are specific passages where they're going out to the sea, and I want to say it's in John chapter 3 or John chapter 6. There's this part where they all go out into the Sea of Galilee, and it says that they went out a certain amount of stadia, which is a distance, and then John gives the detail that they're in the middle of the sea, and people have corroborated this today. They went out to the Sea of Galilee. They went out the distance that John says, and sure enough, they were in the middle of the sea. And so it's just these small details that it's like, yeah, you would expect a fisherman to get that right and not other people, right? So all that to say, there's just these little details in the Gospels that line up perfectly. It fits like a glove with the attestation, with the manuscript evidence, with everything that we've mentioned already. It all fits like a glove together. And I think that all these multiple lines of evidence pointing to the exact same reality is really good reason to accept the idea that the Gospels are not anonymous.
Yeah, actually, I've never heard the argument that the Gospels are idiosyncratic with the authors that wrote them. I think that that's a really strong point. I haven't heard that before, but that actually makes a lot of sense if you've read these Gospels. That they do seem like they're from someone that is a tax collector or from someone that is a physician, because Luke is very exact. He is very precise. We keep
Mhm.
finding over and over again that he was correct in what he said about various historical facts. And for a long time, we thought that he was incorrect. And then he keeps getting vindicated again and again. So I think that that's a really strong point.
Yeah, I think so too. And what's interesting is Richard Bauckham. He has done his famous work, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, on why he thinks that Mark also shows a lot of signs of being from Peter as well. Those are a little bit harder to identify, so I didn't want to get into those. That's why I didn't mention Mark. But there are really good reasons as well to think that Peter's idiosyncrasies are behind the Gospel of Mark as well. So that's pretty interesting. But now we're going to move on and just ask the question, what does this leave us with? Number one, manuscripts with authors' names on them, pointing them towards known authors, not anonymous ones. Two, external attestation, which corroborates the titles on those manuscripts. Three, internal evidence, which fits perfectly with the manuscript and attestational evidence. And four, a complete lack of debate about it, while truly anonymous works did have contested authorship. So the question is this: given everything we've seen so far, does it look like the Gospels are the result of an uncontrolled, informal tradition where the stories spread by randomized word of mouth, eventually being copied down by anonymous authors, unknown to early Christian communities who didn't know Jesus or anyone who knew Jesus? Or does it sound like they are the result of a formal, controlled tradition where the stories were written down by eyewitnesses who cared about preserving the truth of Jesus' life, ministry, death, and resurrection? To me, I think the answer is pretty clear. What do you think, Daniel?
Yeah, I think that the answer is very clear. And I just want to be very clear as well about the point of all this, which is to establish these other relevant facts, which are going to be very important when we get into talking about Paulogia's video, because he's going to try to downplay what we're talking about and act like this stuff is not relevant. So the point is to show that these are relevant facts, and that when Paul tries to dismiss them, that he's really not able to dismiss these in the way that he's going to attempt to. And also, the point is to just show some of the presuppositions that Paul is going to be putting forward right now, so that when he presents those presuppositions later, we can say, look, this is a presupposition that we talked about, and we talked about why that doesn't work. And that's going to show why his theory is not a good one at the end of the day.
Yeah, it can be seen as an explanation, but is it a good one? I'm probably going to ask that question quite a few times as we're going through his video, because that's what it seems like to me. It seems like he's giving an explanation, just kind of sure it works, it explains things, but is it a good one? When we're making an inference, we want to make an inference to the best explanation, not just an inference to a general explanation. I don't think that that's what we should do. And I also love this quote from Sherlock Holmes that I have to bring up. He says, "It is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data, and sensibly one begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts." And so My question for this is going to be, are we going to have a theory of naturalism or skepticism towards the Bible? Or do we have a theory that the Gospels are uncontrolled informal traditions and anonymous, and all the facts are going to just have to fit into that theory? Or rather, are we going to look at all the facts that we just looked at and require our theory to fit what we've looked at? So I think that's really important. Do you have anything to say on that, Daniel, before we get started on watching the video?
No, I think that we are ready to go.
All right. Well, let me get the video on screen, and then we will get ready to watch this. And thank you, everyone, for being patient with us as we went through his presuppositions, because I think that is a really, really important part of this discussion. Getting into why I do not believe that his presuppositions are able to explain all of the data that we have. So let's get started finally into Paulogia's video.
When presenting the case that Jesus rose from the dead, the Christian will often point to a set of historical facts which generally boil down to Jesus was crucified, people claimed he rose from the dead, and now the church exists. Now, would an actual resurrection of Jesus explain these facts? I suppose, but a supernatural explanation can be used to explain anything. Did an all-powerful being have a hand in starting my car this morning? It's certainly possible. But it's also possible that when I turned the key, a mechanical process drew air and fuel into the cylinders, a spark was ignited, combusting the system to begin the engine revving. We can't rule out that God started my car, but his involvement isn't necessary to explain my running car. Is there a similar explanation for the existence and history of Christianity? Please indulge me for a minute and allow.
Yeah, so I want to talk about that real quick. Essentially, what Paul is going to try to argue is that the naturalist explanation, if there is a naturalist explanation, then that's pretty much going to be the default, and that we should just go with that explanation. And I want to give an analogy or a scenario that I think will help everyone to understand why that's not necessarily the case. Now, it can be the case that a naturalist explanation is better than another sort of explanation. But here, let me give a scenario. Let's imagine that we're watching wind and waves and various natural or what seem to be natural phenomena, and they somehow are moving giant rocks and polishing them and doing these crazy things with these rocks. And it all seems to be happening through natural causes, and we watch as a pyramid is formed. Okay, like a pyramid that we might see in Egypt, right? And we watch, it takes like many years, but somehow these rocks, they're cut precisely by the wind, and then they're moved by the wind, and we only see natural causes that bring about this perfectly precise pyramid. Somehow like the water pushes the rock exactly to the right place. Now, we could say that we have a totally naturalist explanation for this formation of a pyramid. We could say that because that's all we see. But would that be the best explanation for this formation of a pyramid? And I think the answer from everybody would be absolutely not. Okay. Even though we have a naturalist explanation, we only saw naturalist phenomena. Even in that sort of situation, we would reject the theory that this phenomena is explained only by natural causes. So I think that that's something that is really important in this discussion is what is the best explanation? And in this situation with the pyramid, obviously the best explanation is that somehow a mind is directing these naturalist causes, and it's not just naturalist mindless causes by themselves. And in the same way, the best explanation we're going to argue for the facts, both the minimal facts and the relevant facts, is that there is a supernatural mind that is operating in the world and caused the resurrection of Jesus Christ. What do you think about that, Nathan?
Yeah. And what's interesting is I also want to say, because we have been qualifying our response to Paulogia throughout this video by saying that, he's responding to Gary Habermas. But I also want to say I don't think that his explanation is even as good as Gary Habermas's. So I do want to defend Gary Habermas in the sense that I think that the resurrection is the best explanation of the minimal facts. What I think Paulogia has done, however, is I think he's given the best atheist attempt that I have seen against it. It's a response to Gary Habermas. And so we're going to defend both the minimal facts and we're also going to defend extra relevant facts as we're going through this. And I totally agree with what you were saying that as we're looking for explanations, we need to try to make an inference to the best explanation. Sure, what Paulogia has provided is an explanation. I might even grant that it does explain all of Gary Habermas's minimal facts, even if I don't think it does so well or if it does so poorly. Um, it's still not going to be a good explanation. And so, as we're going throughout this video, we need to ask the question, is this just an explanation or is it the best explanation? And I think that I believe the answer becomes very clear that this is simply an explanation and not the best explanation as we get further into the video.
Allow me to lay out one possible scenario. Around 30 AD, the Middle East was littered with apocalyptic preachers, including one Jesus of Nazareth. This Jesus said or did the wrong things at the wrong time to the wrong people and was crucified on a cross. As was a standard Roman practice for the crucified, Jesus' body was thrown into an unmarked grave outside of town.
All right, I've got to stop it there. There's no way that he is going to be allowed to say something like that without me responding to that. Okay, so he basically just said that Jesus was crucified. No disagreements there. I'm sure that you grant that fact as well, Darwin, to Jesus, that Jesus was crucified?
Yes, absolutely.
All right, so the part that I want to contest is that Jesus was thrown in an unmarked grave. Now, I think this is really, really important for his case. This is probably the most important part of his case, and he just flew by it as if like it was nothing. I think this is probably the crux of his entire case. Was Jesus buried in a tomb or not? I really think this is like probably the most important part of his case. So I really want to harp on this for a minute. So the reason he says this, just to give everybody a little background knowledge, is outside of Judea. So everywhere else in the Roman Empire, outside of Judea, it was the common practice for a crucified victim to either stay on the cross and basically rot because the humiliation was a part of that's kind of like a part of the death. It was about the humiliation and the shame as well, because they're in a shame, honor and shame culture. And so basically he's wanting to say, and it's the standard practice in the Roman Empire for the crucified victim to either stay on the cross and rot, or if the Sanhedrin was to take Jesus off the cross, they would have buried him in like a mass grave somewhere because he was put to shame. And so he would not receive an honorable burial. And so basically what Paulogia wants to say is, well, there you go. It's the common practice. Now it's on you, Christians. The burden of proof is on you to show why I should believe that Jesus in his burial is actually a historical thing. And so there's a few things that are really important to note here. Are there any big cities, Daniel, that I don't want you to like give away where you live or anything, but have you ever been to like a big city that has like a specific culture that is very unique to them?
Yeah, I mean, I think of places like Philadelphia, I suppose, where you've got different places within that city that are very, very different in their cultures. You know, you literally have different classes, different ecosystems, if you will, within that city. So, yeah, I think that that's definitely the case.
Yeah, and the reason I ask you this is because Judea is the province in the Roman Empire where Jerusalem is, where the temple is. So there's going to be this very specific subculture inside of Judea that isn't going to match anywhere else in the Roman Empire. And so, first of all, I just want to say, I don't think it's going to be surprising that we might find some unique practices particular to Judaism in the province of Judea. So, I'm not going to say that that's enough to establish the burden of proof, but I just want to give that as a topologia as something to think about, that it is its own, it's going to have its own subculture because it is kind of like the hub for Judaism. Now, as far as the burial narrative itself in the Gospels, we have, I would say, two independent sources because Matthew and Luke do use Mark as a source in the burial narrative specifically. So it'd be too quick to say, oh, the burial's mentioned in all four gospels, therefore four sources. What we would say is Mark is a source, and then John is said to be written independently of Matthew and Luke. So uh, John would be a second source, and that's just within the gospels themselves. And then we have 1 Corinthians 15, which says that Jesus was buried according to the scriptures. We read that creed earlier. And then in Acts chapter 2, there's an interesting reference where he's preaching, and he references David's tomb and contrasts it with Jesus's tomb. And he says that David's tomb is still with us to this day, which is a reference to the empty tomb. So pretty interesting. And all this points to a known burial location, because Paulogia wants to say either Jesus rotted on the cross or he was thrown in a mass grave somewhere. But all of this contradicts the idea and is pointing to a known burial location. Now, what's even more interesting is we have a quote from Josephus in his book Wars of the Jews, and it says this: "Nay, they proceeded to the degree of impiety as to cast away their dead bodies without burial, although the Jews used to take so much care of the burial of men that they took down those who were condemned and crucified and buried them before the going down of the sun. I should not mistake it if I said that the death of Ananus was the beginning of the destruction of the city." So notice he's saying that he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. So before the destruction of Jerusalem, he's saying that the Jews would take down crucified victims and have them buried. Okay, so this is a very, very important key. And then also we have, if we look in archaeology, we have Johannan's heel bone. In 1968, there was a bone found in an ossuary, which an ossuary is just a bone box, and it has the the crucifixion nail in the heel of the heel bone, and it's in the bone box. And so we see that there was a man who was crucified, and he was in an ossuary, which means he was buried in the first century. The ossuary dates to the first century in Judea. So we not only have testimonial evidence from the Gospels, from the Creed in 1 Corinthians 15, from Acts, we also have corroborating evidence from Josephus, and we have archaeological evidence from that heel bone that was discovered. And so to me, it is going to be on Paulogia to I just so people know, because I always pronounce his name wrong. I always used to say Paulogia, and now I'm trying to pronounce it the way Paulogia says it. So if I mispronounce your name, I'm sorry. Paulogia. It's going to be on him to overcome all this evidence, because not only do we have testimonial evidence in the Bible, we have it outside the Bible, and we have archaeology that backs it up. And I also think that the empty tomb narratives are going to be really important as well, because the empty tomb narratives presuppose the burial narratives. So for those to be in the Gospels as well, those can be used as evidence for the burial narratives as well. So that's really important. And then if we were to think about the empty tomb narratives being found by women, that's going to fulfill the criterion of embarrassment, right? Why would the apostles and the disciples, if they were going to lie and make something up and they're just receiving hearsay, why would they keep that part in? If it's not about historicity, if it's not about, allowing the testimony to match the historical data, why would they allow the story to have women being the one that found it? This doesn't make any sense at all. And also with the empty tomb as well, what's very interesting is that we have a manuscript, or an inscription rather, called the Nazareth inscription. And this is an inscription that's typically dated to the first half of the first century. And it says this: "You are absolutely not to allow anyone to move those who have been entombed. But if someone does, I wish that the violator suffer capital punishment under the title of tomb breaker." So we can see again in archaeology that someone, if they stole a body, they're going to be killed. And I think you would agree, Daniel, that the punishment there does not match the crime. And so we have to ask, why in Judea is there this edict in the first century that's so harsh on someone stealing a body? Well, I think the answer's found in the Gospels. Matthew says that the Jews spread a rumor that said they stole the body, right?
hmm Yeah, I want to say that the argument that Paul G is making is that this is something that was done in most of the kingdom, and therefore we should think that it was done here in Judea, and that simply doesn't follow. It doesn't follow that there weren't any exceptions to this rule. Just because there is a general rule, that doesn't mean that there are no exceptions. And obviously, if Jesus was buried, then he was an exception. And it doesn't follow that here's this thing that normally happens, therefore it happens in all cases. So he's making a bad argument there. And do we have good reasons to think that Jesus was the exception? Yes, we absolutely do. We have all the reasons that you just said, and all of the gospels say that Jesus was in fact buried in a tomb and that he rose. We also have that creed that we talked about earlier that said that Jesus was buried and rose again. So there's a lot of other evidence that Jesus was in fact buried in a tomb and that his location was known. And I think that this is totally fair to bring up, because if Paulogia is going to be like, oh, well, I've accounted for Habermas's minimal facts with this theory over here, and then the theory is clearly false based on other facts, I think it's totally fair to bring up those other facts. Like if Paulogia had to say, well, I'm addressing Gary Habermas's minimal facts, and then Paulogia's theory had to assume something that was just blatantly untrue. Like, let's say Paulogia had to assume that crucifixions didn't happen in Rome or something like that. When we know that they did, we would be like, well, yeah, you may have accounted for the minimal facts, but you had to do it in a way that literally denies the historicity of crucifixions that Rome was doing. And in the same way, when he says that I can account for the minimal facts, but I just have to act like there was no empty tomb or that Jesus wasn't buried in a tomb, he's doing the same thing, because we have really good reasons to think that Jesus was actually buried in a tomb. So that becomes immediately relevant in showing why his theory is not good.
Yes, and I have one more small thing I have to share on this because I really want to drive this home. Again, I think this is the most important part of his case, and so I have to drive this home for the audience, because if we can show that the burial narrative and the empty tomb narratives are historical, I really do not think that Paulogia's case can even begin to get off the ground, because kind of like Daniel just said, he's having to assume that the historical record and all of the evidence that I'm presenting right now is false for some reason, but I don't think he's going to be able to account for all of this. So the earliest opponents of Christianity presuppose the empty tomb. This is really, really important. Matthew 28, again, I already mentioned this, but the Jews basically met with the soldiers that were at the tomb, and they told them to say, his disciples came at night and stole the body. So this can very easily explain the Nazareth inscription, which is something I brought up a minute ago about killing those and giving them capital punishment, those who steal a body from a tomb. This right here can easily explain this. But then if we even go to around the 2nd century, we can see that in Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho, which Trypho is a Jew, by the way, he says this: a godless heresy sprung up from one Jesus, a Galilean deceiver, whom we crucified, but his disciples stole him by night from the tomb where he was laid when unfastened from the cross, and now deceive men by asserting that he was risen from the dead and ascending to heaven. So notice how Trypho, this is what Trypho's saying, that he was stolen by night from the tomb. Okay, so the Jewish people, even in Justin Martyr's time, are showing that this is the rumor, showing that he was put in a tomb, there was a known location, and he's saying it's a godless heresy. Okay, now, even in the 6th century, so 500 years later, right, in the Toldoth Yeshu, this shows that the rumor lasted for hundreds of years. Diligent search was made, and he, Jesus, was not found in the grave where he had been buried. A gardener took him from the grave and brought him into his garden and buried him in the sand over which the waters flowed into the garden. So
Now,
notice,
Ethan, I think you should specify that Toldoth Yeshu, that's not Christians saying that. That's Jews saying that,
yeah,
right?
this is
So
a Jewish source,
this is
exactly.
a Jewish source. So this is very important. This isn't even Christians. This is Jews who are the enemies of Christ at this time. And they are agreeing, once again, we've got enemy attestation here as well, saying that Jesus was in fact buried and his location was known.
Yes, exactly. This is really, really important stuff because, again, we have all the testimony of the burial. We have all the things that I mentioned earlier, that the burial narrative has all this testimony. It has archaeological evidence corroborating it. It has all these things. We have the empty tomb narrative, which has corroborating evidence. But then on top of that, the opponents of Christianity, the Jewish people, they're saying that he was stolen. which presupposes a known location. How could Jesus's body be stolen from a cross if it just rotted on the cross? Or how could Jesus's body be stolen if they don't know where it was buried? All of this presupposes a known burial location. So, yeah, I'm probably going to leave that here and we'll go back to Paulogia's video. But I just had to drive this home because to me, that is the most important part of Paulogia's case is, the idea that the burial and all that is just a fictional narrative that was added on over time because, yeah, he flew by it so fast. He said it in one sentence, but it's like that right there is the key. So now hopefully we've shown, and Paulogia, if you ever see this, I want to say, you need to account for all this evidence. I don't think you can just say, oh, well, it's not one of Habermas's facts. It's not one of Habermas's 5 or 6 facts or however many you're responding to. So I don't have to account for it. It's just a legend. It's just something that was made up. No, there's testimonial evidence in his favor. There's archaeological corroborating evidence. There's testimonial corroborating evidence from Josephus. There is the earliest opponents of Christianity presupposing that there was a known location, and I think that was all that we brought up so far. So all
Yeah.
to say, there is so much evidence in favor of this not being a legend.
Well, yeah, I mean, and let's think about it. Let's imagine for a second that we have a situation where there's a murder that's been committed, and there are certain facts that seem very pertinent to the case. Like there's a hammer with blood on it, there's a fingerprint, there's this, there's that. Okay, and let's say Paulogia looks at these facts and he says, "Listen, I know that you think a murder happened here, but it didn't happen because I can explain this with this theory over here." But then his theory requires that the owner of or the person that was murdered not have a car. Okay, for example, like in order for Paul's theory to not work, this person must not have a car. Now that's not one of the initial facts. The initial facts are like the murder, the blood, et cetera, et cetera. But for Paul's theory to work, now the victim must not own a car. But then you're like, but Paul, they do own a car. That now becomes totally relevant because that disqualifies his theory. So his theory needs to not only account for the minimal facts, it also needs to account for other facts if they are in direct contradiction with his overall theory. And that's what we're seeing here.
Yes, and even if he's wanting to write this off as, oh well, it's not one of Gary Habermas's facts, so I don't care. It's just part of the legend. I don't have to account for it. What I would say to that is that you're not accounting for the facts well, and we're going to get into that later because you're going to actually start talking about the minimal facts too. And I don't think you're going to be able to account for the minimal facts very well either. But just throwing these facts away because they're not minimal facts, I just don't think that's going to work at all for all the reasons that we've shared. Let's keep going.
Jesus had some followers while he was alive, but most disappeared into lives never recorded by reliable history, never to be heard from again, all except Simon Peter and possibly John. For a culture without last names, there were a lot of people named John. Devastated after the death of his mentor, Peter may have suffered post-bereavement hallucinatory experiences, or PBHE, a well-researched phenomenon documented in papers like these. With PBHE,
Do we want to comment there, or do we want to let him finish his thought on PBHEs?
Let him finish.
Okay.
a lonely, low-mood, fatigued, anxious, bereaved person without history of mental disorder will have an abnormal sensory experience. In about a third of the cases, the individuals will report seeing, hearing, and talking to someone deceased. Or Peter merely decided that Jesus' message of the coming kingdom was too important and that he would take it upon himself to spread it in the wake of his mentor's death.
Okay. So, do you want to go first, or do you want me to speak on this?
Yeah, so there's a few things. He's positing two different theories in a way. He's saying that either Peter had a hallucination, and so then he thought that Jesus rose from the dead because of this grief hallucination, or Peter just decides that he's going to go and tell everybody that Jesus rose from the dead, even though he knows that that didn't in fact happen. Now, I have a lot to say about both of these theories. I think the second theory is very bad because you have to understand that for Peter to knowingly lie and tell people that Jesus rose from the dead when he didn't, that would be incredibly serious. unbelievably serious for people at that time because Peter was Jewish and nobody expected for God to send himself in the flesh as a human being and to die on a cross and to rise from the grave. So if Peter was going and telling people that Jesus Christ was God and that he rose from the dead, this would be total heresy and he would essentially be committing his family and friends to hell for no reason. And then he was willing to die for a lie. It just simply is absurd and preposterous to think that he would do something like that. And to to uh, to deal with his first theory, which is the grief hallucination, I actually have 7 reasons why I think that this doesn't work. Do you want me to go through all 7? I can do it pretty quickly, I think.
Yeah, I will just make one super short comment on what you just said. The second theory about Jesus or Peter just making it up. I really don't think that aligns with early Christian teaching. Like the early Christians taught humility, being honest, giving of yourself, like all these things. And so I just don't think that that lines up at all with the early Christian movement. So I'll just say that.
Yeah, I completely agree. So let me go through 7 reasons why I think that this grief hallucination theory fails. Number one, Peter was in no position to convince anybody. He literally denied Jesus Christ 3 times, and he was basically gone and in shame. I mean, he was kind of like the leader before this, but imagine he said, I'm not going to deny you, Christ. And then he publicly denies Jesus Christ 3 times. So the idea that he would go back and be able to somehow convince the apostles or the disciples at that time or whatever, I think that that's really incredibly difficult to believe that he would be able to do that. Whether he was lying to them or had a grief hallucination, I don't think they would have cared what he had to say at all. The second reason is that if Peter hallucinated, why did James convert? Because James was the brother of Jesus Christ. And James was a skeptic of Jesus Christ. We learn that in the Gospels. So the idea that James would convert to Christianity after Jesus was humiliated and died on the cross just because Peter told him is frankly preposterous. I mean, imagine you don't believe your brother. People are telling you he's doing these miracles, and you're like, no, he's not, because you're Jesus's brother, and you don't believe in it. And then Jesus dies this humiliating death. And then all of a sudden, here comes one of Jesus' followers, and he's saying, hey, he rose from the dead. Would you believe that just taking Peter's word for it and commit your entire life and ultimately die a martyr's death because Peter said that Jesus rose from the dead? Would you do that? The answer is absolutely not. Something else happened. So this grief hallucination theory does not explain the conversion of James, the brother
And
of
real
Jesus
and real
Christ.
quick, a better explanation is what we find in First Corinthians 15, where First Corinthians 15 explicitly says that Jesus appeared to James after he rose. That's a better explanation for James's conversion.
Correct. Number 3 is that the hallucination theory cannot explain Paul's conversion. So Paul, he was an enemy of Christians, and he was literally on his way to kill more Christians. I guess Paulogia is going to talk about this in a bit, so I think I'll wait to talk about this number 3. So number 4 is that Jesus appeared to many, not just Peter. So we find a very early historical record, which we've talked about with the Creed. So this wasn't a much later development later on, like 40, 50, 200 years later. No, between 3 months and 3 years, we have this creed saying that Jesus was seen by many people, 500. He was shown to the 12. He was seen by by James, the brother of Christ, which I just talked about. So Jesus appeared to many, not just Peter, according to very, very, very early tradition. So this theory that Peter only was the only one that maybe saw Jesus Christ is not accounting for the fact that many saw Jesus Christ very soon after he was thought to have been dead. So that's number 4. Number 5 is the hallucination theory can't explain the empty tomb, which we just talked about that in great detail. So that's definitely, I think that's the strongest refutation of this theory. And then number 6 is a lone hallucination wouldn't overturn Jewish theology, which is what I was talking about just a few minutes ago. The Jews had this idea that the Messiah was going to be this conqueror, that he was going to help the Jews to overthrow Rome, They had no conception that he would be God in the flesh or that he would die on a cross and then come back 3 days later. That would have been total heresy. And that's why Jesus was crucified in the first place, because he told the religious Jews, the Pharisees, that he was God. That's what he said to them when they challenged him. He essentially said, I am God. And that's why they ripped their robes and they said, I don't need to hear anything else. He's a blasphemer and we're going to crucify you now. And that's what happened. So a lone hallucination would never overturn what the Jews thought at that time about what the Messiah was supposed to be. And yet the Jewish religion was overturned. I mean, Paul was Jewish. All of the early disciples and apostles were all Jewish, and the people that they converted were all Jewish. And yet, all these people were shown something so powerful that they completely abandoned their what they would have thought of, which was heresy, and embraced it. And I don't think that one man who had been disgraced already, his hallucination or his word would be nearly enough to cause such a thing. I think that that's just preposterous. Really stretches the limits of incredulity. The seventh reason is that the New Testament authors would have been lying. And what I mean by that is the New Testament authors all say that Jesus was seen by multiple people, except for Mark. I don't think Mark says it, but all the other New Testament authors say that Jesus was seen by a multitude of different people at the same time in various places once Jesus is crucified and comes back. And so it's strange to think that the New Testament authors would lie about something like that and then also tell the truth about other uncomfortable facts. So, for example, the New Testament authors are very honest about the fact that Peter abandoned Christ in his moment of need. And they're also very honest about the women who found Jesus not there at the empty tomb. They admitted that women were the first witnesses of the empty tomb, which actually would have been something that would have been embarrassing to admit, because these men didn't want to have to rely on women as eyewitnesses, but they said that women discovered the empty tomb first. And they also relate to us that the gospels, or sorry, that the disciples of Jesus Christ, that they made mistakes and they are constantly embarrassing themselves. Throughout the gospels, you're reading the accounts and you're like, man, why are these guys such idiots when you're reading about these disciples? So what I'm trying to say here is that if these gospel authors were lying about Jesus being seen by many eyewitnesses, why wouldn't they lie and embellish the fact that why would they be honest about Peter and his failings, or the other apostles, or the women that discovered the empty tomb? Why wouldn't they lie about that too? But instead, it seems like they're very honest about all those things. So it's very hard to believe that they would be so brutally honest about all these things over here and then lie and say that Jesus was seen by many people, not just by Peter. So those are the 7 reasons that I've got.
All really great stuff. And I will say as well, I think that the post bereavement hallucination idea, to me, the biggest issue with it is that it doesn't seem to me that if you hallucinate that someone you loved had, or rather, if you have a hallucination of someone that you love that has passed away, you're not going to come to the conclusion that they rose from the dead. In fact, there's a brand new book that just came out. I'm going to show it on screen really quick. Let me go on full screen just for a second. So this is called Resurrection, Extraordinary Claim, or Extraordinary Evidence for an Extraordinary Claim by Nick Meter. This is a brand new book. It just came out, and it's based on psychological research. He's also a statistician, so he talks about probability theory and things like that in the book. I'm not totally done with it, but based on what he's saying, a lot of new psychological research is showing that the hallucination theory is not a very good explanation of the facts. So it's just people are not going to come to the conclusion that someone rose from the dead. And in fact, when Paulogia cites a lot of these sources and says, look at these papers, like a lot of different people have post-bereavement hallucinations. How many of them come to the conclusion that their loved one rose from the dead? And I think that that question's an important one to answer. Do you have anything else you want to say on that?
No, I think we covered it well. Let's keep going.
All right.
At some point, Jesus' brother James joined the cause. along with one of the Johns. Stories about Jesus began to spread, not primarily by Peter, but
Pause
rather
just for
through
a
the
second. I just want to highlight that he said at some point Jesus' brother James joined the cause. And I just want to remind everybody why that would be so ridiculous that James would just join the cause because Peter either lied to him or had a grief hallucination, and that James is just going to believe, oh yeah, my brother who I don't believe, who was fooling everybody or whatever, who I don't believe in. I guess I'll just take your word for it, Peter, and join the cause. So I think that that's really preposterous.
I completely agree. And also, he's about to use one of his presuppositions we flagged in my presentation right here, where he's saying they're just going to start spreading a bunch of rumors. So let's listen to that.
person to person evangelism of the day. Neighbors talking to neighbors, merchants talking to customers. These conversations were meant to recruit new followers, not relay an accurate oral history. So, in the
All right. So notice that they're spreading it like gossip, kind of. It's like I tell you, you go tell your friend, they go tell their friend, and then eventually it all gets written down. That's the idea of a informal, uncontrolled tradition that I mentioned earlier. And we already went through all the lines of evidence for why the gospels are the exact opposite.
Yeah, and to me, one of the biggest problems with this theory, and I just want to remind everybody what that was, is the fact that the gospels corroborate each other so well. So if these were just people talking to people and legends developing, we wouldn't expect for them to harmonize each other with each other as well as they do, and to answer questions as if they were actually written by eyewitnesses. So I think what do you call that again, Nathan?
Undesigned coincidences.
Undesigned coincidences. Thank you. So yeah, the fact that we have these undesigned coincidences is really good evidence that Paulogia is incorrect. But we also gave a bunch of other reasons why he's wrong about the Gospels and where they came from and how they came to be.
Yeah, the name data as well, how it points to first century Judea. And then on top of that, there's another one that I didn't mention in the presentation. It's called artless similarities, which refers to how different characters are very, very similar across multiple different contexts. So, like Peter is very similar in all the Gospels, and Mary and Martha and John and Luke. There's like different stories with them in it, and Mary and Martha are very similar, even in different contexts. Jesus, the way he responds to certain critiques of himself, is very similar in different contexts, even in different gospels. And what this points to is that there's a historical person that is being pointed to. So, like, the question you have to ask is, did Luke and Matthew independently come up with the idea that when Jesus is questioned about healing on the Sabbath, that he responds by saying something like this: don't you have a sheep that if they fell into a hole or a pit, wouldn't you not get them out on the Sabbath? Or if you have a donkey, would you not lead him to drink something on the Sabbath? How much more important is a person than they? Is it really going to be likely that two independent authors came up with these independent sayings that are so similar to one another? Or is it just going to be the case that Jesus, when he was historically challenged in this way, this is how he historically responded? I think that's a much better explanation.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. I mean, I think between the two of us, we gave about 5 to 9 reasons for why he's completely wrong about this idea that we don't know who wrote the Gospels, and this idea that they're just anonymous and that they developed as some kind of later legend. So remember, Paulogia is saying that this needs to be part of his theory, and he's saying that this is how the Gospels came to be. And so I think it's completely fair to show, no, that doesn't work, because
Mhm.
there are other facts in history that if you were right, we wouldn't expect to see these other things. We wouldn't expect to see the church accept such documents and teach from them, right? We wouldn't expect to see
Mhm.
these undesigned coincidences, on this theory. We wouldn't expect to see all these other reasons that we've listed. So that's why I think that this is completely fair what we're bringing up.
And I'll say one more comment. This is also why it's not enough, Apologia, to merely respond to Gary Habermas's minimal facts. It is not enough. You have to explain all the relevant data. And he's going to want to say, oh, you're just saying for the Bible tells me so and all this stuff. No, we're not. I'm not assuming that the Bible is inspired in making these arguments. Undesigned coincidences do not assume that the Gospels are inspired. it points to that idea. Authorial idiosyncrasies, the fact that like the authors appear like tax collectors when it's Matthew, or appears like a doctor when it's Luke, or appears like a fisherman when it's John. These things point to the authorship that we have. And so we're not assuming that the Bible is inspired. And this is why it's not a good explanation. And this is why we mentioned at the beginning, it's it's one thing to have an explanation. It's another thing to have a good explanation.
Telling details were expanded upon, embellished, or even invented each time they were recounted. As the movement began a life of its own, Peter the fisherman was not around to personally affirm or correct the tales being told.
There's that presupposition again. It's spreading like gossip. They're making it up as they go. Peter's not there to keep it from changing. And we've already explained why all that doesn't work. They're passing on cultivated traditions, and they're doing it in Kriya and memorized small, short, memorizable poems and anecdotes and things like this, so that it's easy to pass on. The variation is only between 10 to 40%, which is the accepted and encouraged rate of variation within that time. So all of this is just already been addressed.
A few years later, a Pharisee named Saul was traveling around persecuting these new Christians, burying the moral guilt of his actions under the certainty that he was doing the will of God. But on his way to Damascus, he suffered a psychotic break, possibly some form of guilt-induced post-traumatic stress, manifesting in a vision of the allegedly resurrected leader of the group he was harming. So affected by this experience, Saul changed his name to Paul and began recruiting for Christianity and writing letters to churches outlining his theology. Paul.
Yeah, I want to respond to that. So I didn't talk about this initially because I knew that he brings it up later. So let me tell you why I think that this is also ridiculous. I want to get into some detail here. I'm going to read from this thread that I wrote about this very video. Um, so if Peter had had an hallucination, that alone wouldn't explain why Paul, a fierce opponent of Christianity who was actively persecuting Christians, suddenly changed his entire life and became one of its most prominent leaders. Advocates of the hallucination theory sometimes claim that Paul must have had a guilt hallucination, but this explanation doesn't work for a multitude of reasons. Firstly, Paul was not experiencing guilt. Okay, this is very important. He was literally on his way to kill more Christians when he saw the risen Christ. Okay, he was on his way to Damascus to kill more Christians. This was not a man that was feeling guilty. Furthermore, his vision resulted in actual blindness for 3 days. And this is not something that a mere hallucination would cause. Think about that. If he had just had this hallucination or whatever, a guilt hallucination, why would he go blind? That's not something that we would expect at all. But if Jesus was there and caused him to go blind, like what Paul actually said, that would actually explain his temporary blindness. But most importantly, after his experience, Paul went to meet with Peter and James, who were two of the central figures in early Christianity, and they confirmed that they too had seen the risen Christ. Paul himself records this meeting in Galatians 1:18 through 19, where he says, "Then after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas and remained with him 15 days. But I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother." So here we see that Paul went and spoke with Peter and James. And did Peter and James reject Paul, or did they accept Paul? They accepted Paul. Even though Paul had been killing Christians before that, he was accepted by two prominent leaders, the two prominent leaders of Christianity. Why? Obviously, they compared notes. Obviously, they talked about what they had seen. Do you think that if Paul had described Jesus in a way that didn't accurately describe Jesus, that he would have been accepted into the Christian movement as a leader? I don't think so. I would say not on your life. So whatever Paul said to James and to Peter was incredibly compelling, and they accepted him in. And this corroborates that all three of them saw the same thing because they all would have tested each other. So they all saw the same thing, and that corroborates what all three of them saw, that they all saw it and that they all had the same story. So I think that this is incredibly convincing and compelling evidence that Paul also saw the risen Christ. And it wasn't just Paul and it wasn't just Peter, it was also James.
Yeah, there's a specific line in Galatians where he says, "They added nothing to my message." And
Right.
it's like, so they were in complete agreement on what they saw, what they believed. And again, if we're going to go with only Paul and only Peter had hallucinations, how do you explain James being there and agreeing on everything? Kind of like Daniel already mentioned, it's ridiculous to believe that Peter could convince James after Jesus was put to shame. We have to remember they're in an honor and shame culture. Crucifixion was the most amount of shame someone could go through. So Jesus was basically at the bottom of the bottom of the bottom of society whenever he was killed. Which, I mean, first of all, it makes the gospel so much more beautiful when you recognize that Jesus would do that for us. But second of all, understanding that this is what he went through, and this is the status that he was in, and then James to believe someone who had a post bereavement hallucination that he somehow interpreted as someone rising from the dead, which is also going to be a problem. It's just absurd, I think, at least. Anything else you want to say?
No, I think that we covered it. So this theory that Paul also had some kind of hallucination is just totally ridiculous.
Paul, Peter, and John once met in person to swap ideas, but in the end, they didn't actually see eye to eye on things. After several decades, a variety of Greek speaking people who never met Jesus, or even Peter, took it upon themselves to begin writing down some of the stories that had circulated about Jesus and the sayings attributed to him.
All right, so there it is. He's assuming that the Gospels are anonymous. He's assuming that they didn't know Jesus, didn't know Peter. It was just gossip. It's the telephone game. It's just you told your friend, they told their friend, and then it got passed on and passed on and passed on, and then eventually it got written down. We've already explained why this doesn't work, and I really think that the hardest evidence against this for me is the onomastic congruence, the name data, because again, if you go outside of Judea, the name data drastically changes. And so even if we give the Gospels a late date, like the 70s, 80s, 90s, even if I totally grant that, I think the Gospels were written earlier, but even if I grant that, these biographies are being written within living memory of the disciples being there. And with the onomastic congruence, it is it's going to be really difficult to explain the authorship not being in Judea because, again, as Luke Vanderway pointed out, the onomastic congruence points to first century Judean authorship. And so you're going to have to explain how, within living memory of the apostles, while some of them were still alive, these accounts are being written in Judea, being spread around all over the Roman Empire, and none of the 12 had anything to say about it, and none of the 12 corrected it or anything. It just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I really think that this theory is frankly just very, very lazy. And he's just saying, well, I can account for these minimal facts with this theory, and the theory completely fails with everything else that we know about the actual case and literally contradicts our historical record and all the other evidence. So I think that once again, it's just a terrible theory. But go ahead and let's finish this.
I'll say it one more time. This is why it's important, Paulogia, if you do see this, you cannot just account for the minimal facts. It's not enough to just account for the minimal facts. You can't just say, well, I've accounted for those and everything else is irrelevant. You have to account for all of the relevant data. You should think of the minimal facts like this, because if I were to take a minimal facts route, what I would do is I would take the minimal facts as a starting place. I lay the 4, 5, 6 facts on the table and say, okay, let's start here and then let's begin the conversation. The minimal facts is not the entire discussion. Maybe Habermas approaches it that way, but to me, that's not the best way the argument should be ran. It's here are some facts that we can all agree on because they're accepted by most scholars. Now let's begin the discussion. And as you start to try to throw out explanations like, oh, well, the Gospels are anonymous. Okay, well, let me tell you why that doesn't work. Oh, well, the Gospels were transmitted this way. Okay, let me tell you why that doesn't work. And then you still have to deal with the facts on top of why all of these ad hoc things that you're doing doesn't work as well. So
these written fragments were later compiled into what we now call Gospels, including some links to Old Testament themes, some explanations about how the guy people knew from Nazareth could also be from Bethlehem, and activities they imagined post-resurrection Jesus did.
I have to say as well, he just threw this little one sentence in there. They have some Old Testament themes, No, the Gospels are very Jewish. I've been reading on this recently. It's pretty obvious the Gospels were written by Jewish people or people that were very familiar with Judaism. So um, that kind of throwaway comment isn't even close to sufficient to explain the stuff in the data. Because if he's saying that, Greek speaking, non Jewish, anonymous people wrote the Gospels, that would not account for the Jewishness of the Gospels either. And now he's going to bring up the Gnostic Gospels, which is just very rich. Let's put it that way.
Great many Gospels were written. Each author who compiled a new version expanded upon Jesus' power and his divinity, going from a preacher who did miracles only under very low profile to the co-creator of the universe who performed publicly at the drop of a hat, to someone who killed and resurrected people out of spite, to a powerful resurrected military man with an anthropomorphic giant talking cross as his sidekick.
All right, so notice how he's trying to say the earliest gospel of Mark is like super modest. And then it just gets crazier and crazier and crazier over time. And then eventually we have the gospel of Peter. Okay. What this fails to understand is that the Christology in Mark is just as high as it is in John. And lots of scholarship has been done on this. Jesus's divinity and all these things is not growing over time. Because notice this picture here. He's trying to say like Jesus is God here. But before that, he's just like a normal dude that kind of said some crazy stuff and haha, Jesus, you got crucified. Like you were a man, but you're the Messiah. But now he's God. And now he's a military guy. And it's just growing and growing. As if a military man with a talking cross is bigger than God, but that's besides the point. But either way, this is a false representation of the Gospels. This is something Alex O'Connor says a lot too, that it's just growing and growing over time and it's mythological development. In reality, the Christology of Mark is just as high as John. They just depict it differently. Do you have anything you want to say on that?
Yeah, I do. What I want to say is that I completely agree with what you're saying, but also he doesn't mention that these last two gospels at the very end, or I don't know if I should call them gospels, but the last two were rejected by the church. And why were they rejected? Because they were totally not credible. So the church was very specific about what it accepted and what it rejected, and it rejected those last two. So to act like the church is just writing stuff and accepting everything is frankly ridiculous. And that's not what happened at all. It's the exact opposite. The church was very stringent about what it accepted and what it taught from. And these two gospels at the end were completely rejected the entire time. So I want to mention that because it is important, I think, to know.
Oh yeah, 100%. I think that's a huge point that these gospels are rejected and you have to answer the question, why were they rejected? And if you ask the early church, what they would have said is these four gospels are written by these four men and these two were not written by the men that they're attributed to. The infancy gospel of Thomas or the gospel of Peter. They would have said this was not written by Peter, this was not written by Thomas, so therefore we reject these. And so now you're going to have a really hard time explaining all that as well. So
Military man with an anthropomorphic giant talking cross as his sidekick. On occasion, some of the early Christians were troublemakers and suffered consequences because of their disruptive behavior. But generally, early Christians had a very live and let live existence, and only relatively infrequently were bothered because of their ideology, though unfortunately it did happen sometimes.
okay, that's not true. Um, I actually forgot about this part being in the video, but I can just respond to this off the top of my head. So he said that Christians kind of had a live and let live experience for the most part. No, dude, Nero, he had Peter and Paul killed. James was killed. He was stoned at the church in Jerusalem. Tacitus records Nero lighting Christians on fire and using them as nighttime lamps, hanging them up on posts at night and lighting them on fire. Uh, Tacitus records Christians were tied up and they had animal hide put on them and they were mauled to death by dogs. He also records Christians, being killed and like ripped apart and things like this. Like it was not a live and let live experience. What is that? That is a
I think it's a
vast overstatement.
fundamental misunderstanding I mean, I don't know if he's lying or just incredibly ignorant, but we have really good reason to think that the early Christians were being killed quite often. I mean, Paul was literally killing Christians. And Paul was later martyred. Peter was martyred. James was martyred, like you said. We have a really good record that the early Christian leaders, all of them except John, were martyred. That's what the tradition says. We find that from the Romans who wrote about it at the time, saying that this was happening. And not only that, but I think we have really good reason to believe that all the apostles were martyred because the tradition says that John wasn't. So if we're just embellishing facts and want to make all of the apostles heroes who were martyred and it wasn't true, why wouldn't they lie about John as well? Instead, they said John lived to be a ripe old age. So they didn't say that John was martyred. And so I think that we have really good reason to think that the rest of the Christians, especially the apostles, were martyred for their faith. There was no live and let live. These men were at risk of dying every day that they were teaching this stuff, and almost every one of them did die except for John.
It's interesting. That's a argument that William Paley uses actually for the Book of Acts. William Paley says that in the Book of Acts, there are different instances in the Gospel. I want to say Acts chapter 4, where basically the Peter and John and some of the apostles are brought before the Sanhedrin, and Luke specifically mentions that they were not persecuted, they were not brought in by force, they were brought in amicably, and then they were released amicably, right? And so because Acts does not exaggerate when they are persecuted, we can trust whenever he says that they were, because he doesn't exaggerate. And so I think that's a very interesting line of reasoning that William Paley would agree with. And then there was one other thing I wanted to say as well on that point about persecution. Oh yeah, we also have no testimony that any of the apostles ever recanted. And so to me, you have to wonder, in 1 Corinthians 15, going back to the creed, we see that there's an appearance to the 12. So the 12, they were a known group within the early apostolic age. We also have in the Gospels themselves, Richard Bauckham has done great work showing that the 12 were a very crucial part of this oral tradition because of their names being within the traditions. Like the way oral traditions work, they would have been a part of the community. So to say that they're not, it just doesn't align with oral traditions and the way they work. So yeah, all that to say, it's just none of this lines up, because the earliest Christians, they were a big part of this group, and we have no testimony that any of them recanted. And then later Christians are willing to die for their faith as well, to Nero, to even in the 90s or so, Pliny the Younger, in his dialogue with Trajan, they're basically saying like, all right, I've got all these Christians and they won't recant. They won't worship our gods. What do I do with them? And basically Trajan says, give them a couple chances. And if they don't recant, then kill them.
Yeah, right there. I mean, I just want to be super clear. This is two Romans talking about how they're allowing the Christians the opportunity to recant, and then they're going to kill the Christians if they don't.
Yep, exactly. And so all that to say, like, we have all this evidence of Christians going to their grave. And it's like, you want me to believe that Matthew, and because he said earlier that he only focuses his theory on Peter, James, Paul, and John, because he says these are the only ones we have like evidence for, and like all the other apostles just kind of go into obscurity. So he basically wants me to believe that like Philip and Andrew and Matthew and Judas, not Iscariot, or Thomas, and all these guys totally gave up on the movement, just went on and lived their lives again, and only these 3 or 4 guys kept the movement going by themselves. And I just think that's absurd.
Well, it's absurd because of how powerful the movement was. I mean, right away, it's like a bomb went off in Judea and spread. I mean, if you are saying it's just a few guys and all the other apostles were like, oh, yeah, I'm just going to go live my life. Does that sound like that would cause a bomb to go off that's going to just completely start overturning everything to the point where Rome itself became Christian a few hundred years later? I mean, no, absolutely not. No, the apostles saw the risen Christ. and they went and told everybody about it. And it wasn't just the apostles that saw him, it was 500, it was a bunch of other people too. Something really significant happened, and it affected these men's lives so much that they were willing to die for it. So this idea, this theory that a few of the apostles were just, kind of saying, yeah, I guess I saw Jesus Christ, and that's what caused the early Christian movement, which was incredibly powerful, incredibly quick, is preposterous.
Yeah, and on top of that, great point, by the way. Tacitus, again, he records that within just like 100 years, because he's writing in the second century, he says that Christianity had spread all over the place in the Roman Empire. He says like, and he called it a like vicious disease. I forget the exact words that he used. I'm going off the top of my head. He basically calls it like a plague or something. And he says it comes from Jerusalem and it started with this guy named Christus. So obviously Jesus. So basically, kind of like you said, there's this bomb that goes off of like spreading the gospel of Jesus all over the Roman Empire immediately. And you want me to believe that like Philip and Matthew and Andrew and all these guys, even though they're named in a major part of the tradition, according to Richard Bauckham and other scholars, they were no part of it. They just went into obscurity. I think that's ridiculous. So,
They were accepting of people, kind to the poor and widows, and so grew in numbers.
and willing to die for their claims.
Centuries later, in 303 AD, Christianity did become illegal in Rome for a while, but 10 years later it was given legal protection and soon became the Roman Empire's first official religion, which is when it
Actually, that's not true. The Christianity never became the official religion of the Roman Empire. It just gained legal protection, and Constantine became Christian. This is a very popular online myth. It never actually became the official religion of the Roman Empire. So, just want to make that clear.
really took off into the institution we know today. In short, to account for the established history of Christianity, we need only a single disciple to claim Jesus rose, a
Pause it right
later
there.
convert who
So right there, he says, in order to account for the established history of Christianity, but he's literally glossing over the established history of Christianity, except for the facts that he wants to discuss. So if you're
Yeah.
going to say you're accounting for the established history of Christianity, okay, well, you really failed now, because I thought that you were just talking about Gary Habermas's minimal facts. But if you want to talk about the established history of Christianity, now you have to grant the Gospels. Now you have to grant the empty tomb. You've got to grant the creed that we talked about. You've got to grant all of it. So this really fails when he says that, and I didn't realize he said it until just now.
Yeah, and he would probably respond to that just by saying, "Well, what I meant by that is the established minimal facts." So,
That was a poor choice of words then.
yeah. I'll just try to steel man him there and say like that's probably what he would say to respond to you. But yeah, I think that um, first of all, Paulogia, if you see this, I don't think you're accounting for the facts well for all the reasons we've mentioned in this video so far. Um, but also, I think it's really important that you're not accounting for the relevant facts, kind of like we've been saying, that you're maybe technically accounting for the minimal facts, even if you're not doing it as well as the resurrection hypothesis, but you're also not accounting at all for anything beyond them, which is really problematic for your view.
who hallucinated the same, and an urban legend to spread. Now, everything that happens in this origin story I just told is fully consistent with the way first century Rome operated, consistent with basic human nature, and consistent with the spread of every other past and present world religion, most of which you do not think received supernatural help to get where they are. Every aspect of this story is mundane, boring, and exactly what you would expect. With no resurrection required, it explains every fact.
Oh, wait, I did want to say there was one part he said, this is all consistent with what we know about the Roman Empire. No, with the burial narrative again and the empty tomb stuff, I gave all kinds of evidence from the first century, whether it's the Nazareth inscription, whether it's the uh, dialogues about the soul and body and the earliest opponents, whether it's Yehohanan's heel bone, whether it's Josephus's attestation about burying crucified victims. You're not accounting for the Judean data of the first century of burial. So everything you shared is not consistent with first century practice in first century Judea. So that's false.
Yeah, I would just say, to kind of really illustrate the point. I mean, I've asked this question to atheists on my uh, X account, and I said, imagine we have two hypotheses that are available to us for the facts surrounding the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The first hypothesis is that Jesus Christ actually rose from the dead, and that's what explains the facts. And the second hypothesis is that a fish swam in the Mediterranean and got swallowed by a shark. Okay, so these are the two theories that it's either one or the other. Like, let's just say, for sake of the argument, it's either one or the other. So one is a supernatural event, and the other is a mundane event. And we need one of these theories. We need to decide which one of these theories best explains the facts. And I think any rational person would say the best explanation for these facts is the resurrection, if it's between these two. And that's because the other explanation, a fish got swallowed in the Mediterranean by a shark or whatever, that doesn't explain anything. It's like, what does that even have to do with all these other facts? And Paulogia's case is not as bad as that, but the point is that we want to go with the theory that best explains the facts, not a theory that doesn't explain the facts very well. And Paulogia's argument or theory does not explain these facts very well, and he's really pretending like a lot of these facts are not even facts in order to try and say that this theory is even live, and it isn't. So
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't have anything to add there.
Fact you may have. Empty tomb? Part of the legend. No one produced his body? Of course not. It's in an unmarked mass grave. People saw risen Jesus? Part of the legend. We have no record of anyone. Say,
Notice how he's just saying all this is legendary. They're adding stuff. It's all gossip like transmission. They're just making stuff up as they go. It's not a formal controlled tradition. It's an informal, uncontrolled tradition. Oh, and the burial narrative is fictional. So like his body's in a mass grave. These are those presuppositions that we addressed at the beginning of the video that I think don't work at all.
yeah, and notice that all these things that he's saying have to be true. These all just have to be false legends in order for his theory to work. Because if there is an empty tomb, his theory doesn't work. If Jesus did show himself to other people, if other people saw Jesus besides Peter and Paul, then his theory doesn't work. So he's got to say that these things are legends. And as soon as he says that, we can say, well, that's not what the data shows. That's not what is actually true. We have very good reason to think there was an empty tomb. We have very good reason to think that Jesus was seen by way more people than just Peter and Paul, even James, but also the 12 and many other people said that they saw Jesus Christ. So the point is that when he says that these are legends, we have every right to then say here's why that doesn't work, and then therefore your theory doesn't work.
I also have a question for any skeptic watching. I know it's like 2 hours in, so I mean, hopefully we at least have some that are still paying attention. But what is the hermeneutic that he's using to decide what is legendary and what is not? Because it seems to me it's like anything that doesn't fit my theory is legendary, and anything that does is fine. And I would want to know what his hermeneutic is, and because we could do this with any historical event. Like, let's say Alexander the Great, right? We could say, well, I mean, it's not very likely. Like, how many times have we heard of a military leader that's as successful as him, right? So it's much more likely that he had some help, and there were like 3 or 4 other guys that helped him, and they were all doing independent military conquests. And then, Alexander the Great, he just was everybody's favorite. So it kind of just so happened that as the legend grew over time, that it all got taken to his credit, and like the kingdom united under him or whatever, right? And you could just say that's how it actually happened, because I mean, how unlikely is it for that story in its totality to be true? I don't know. It seems like there's no hermeneutic that I can find other than like I'm just trying to come up with an explanation without a resurrection. And it seems like you could do this to any story. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. He's assuming that his view is correct. He's trying to uh, fit the facts into his view. And instead of looking at all of the facts and coming up with a theory that accounts for all of the facts correctly, he's got a theory and then he's rejecting all the facts that don't fit into his theory. And that's, I think, what we're showing here. There are minimal facts, but then there are a bunch of other totally relevant facts. And his theory is totally anti all these relevant facts. So his theory simply does not work.
Yeah. We're almost done here. We'll try to wrap this up.
If Paul's admitted vision, who both gives their name and claims to have seen him. Disciples died for their belief. There are no historical or even biblical records that say any of the 12 disciples did.
That's just not true. James, the son of Zebedee, is mentioned. His death is in Acts chapter 4, I want to say. He was killed by King Herod. And then also we do have Josephus tells us that that James was killed, and then I want to say it's Tacitus tells us that Paul and Peter were killed, or maybe it's Josephus as well. I forget which historian says that, but we definitely have evidence that they were martyred
Yeah,
in
we
the
have
Bible and
historical
outside.
records besides just the church fathers, which also tell us. But even outside of the early church fathers, we have other historical evidence from Romans saying that early Christians were killed, and that Peter was killed, and that James was killed, and that Paul was killed.
Mhm.
So that's completely false, and he's either lying here or very ignorant of what he's talking about.
Yeah, and I think he's probably, because this is from 6 years ago, he's probably modified his view on that part. He probably would have worded that differently now. So I'll try to steel man him there and say he probably would accept Peter, James, and Paul. That if I had to guess, that would be who he would accept were actually martyred. But I don't think he would allow anyone beyond that. I actually think there's a really interesting quote. I want to say it's from Ignatius, who's writing towards the end of the first century, early second century, and he mentions the disciples at one point, and he says that they all conquered death, which was referring to their martyrdom. So I actually do think that we have pretty early attestation that the disciples persevered to the end. So I just think he's wrong.
Others died for the belief. The martyrs probably believed it, but they weren't in a position to know. The Gospels are eyewitness accounts? No, the Gospels are anonymous. Could a supernatural
No, they're not.
miracle explain it all too? Of course, but since a supernatural miracle can explain literally anything, anytime, ever, the question really is, can it be reasonably explained without a resurrection? If you're honest with yourself, you'd have to admit that I have, even if you prefer the miraculous version for some reason or another. And to be sure, there are other ways the presence of Christianity can be explained without invoking the supernatural, but I think this one works well with no big assumptions needed. Is there some aspect of the existence of Christianity that you think my scenario fails to address? Please let me know. Start a dialogue in the comments or on Facebook or Twitter, or better yet, respond in video form. Maybe I'll respond back.
Well, that's exactly what we did, Paulogia, and yeah, I don't think your theory works at all. And I think the end part where he was saying that kind of like tell me something I didn't account for, and it almost felt like he is just wanting to say, okay, if I didn't account for something, let me know, and then I'll make that fit in my theory later.
Yeah, I mean, account for the empty tomb. If Peter and Paul both just had grief hallucinations, why was the tomb empty?
Yeah.
If Peter and Paul just had some weird isolated hallucinations, why did anyone believe them? Right? Why were they able to completely overturn religion that was like 2,000 years old or longer and was very much anti against what Peter and Paul would have been saying? I mean, is it rational to believe that two men saying this sort of stuff would have overturned such ingrained beliefs if there was no actual resurrection of Jesus Christ? I think it's completely preposterous. So there are so many problems with his theory that make it implausible. His theory doesn't account for a bunch of facts. His theory says that the early Christians weren't martyred, and it's got to act like James was somehow just convinced by Peter. It's implausible. It doesn't account for a bunch of facts that we know that are also relevant. And so, yeah, I think the theory just completely fails. I don't think he
Mhm.
can fine tune it and account for these things. I think it just is a failure.
Yeah, I think that the biggest failures for me are some of the presuppositions I mentioned at the top, that the Gospels are anonymous and informal and controlled traditions. I also think the crux of his case, as I said earlier, is that it relies upon the burial and empty tomb narrative being fictional and legendary. And if that's not true, I think that also destroys his case. Um, and so I think those three key things that we showed at the beginning and for a big chunk in the middle, I really think that his theory cannot get off the ground and absolutely devastating. And I think that a lot of your points about the psychology of Peter and Paul and James and how he couldn't convince people, I think all of that is really really good stuff too. So um, let's go ahead and wrap this up, Daniel. I wanted to first of all thank you for coming on, man. It was a pleasure to have you on. Would love to do it again in the future and talk more. Could you again, if anyone's still listening, tell people where to find yourself, and I'll put links to everything down below as well if you just want to go down there.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was a pleasure to be here and do this with you, Nathan. I really enjoyed it. I hope that some people are able to watch this, especially Christians and skeptics, and get some really good information and realize how difficult it actually is to account for the resurrection and the facts of it without just saying that the resurrection is true. It's incredibly difficult. I've never seen it done well, and this is not an exception to that. This is the best I've seen, and it's still terrible and completely fails in my view. So, yeah, thanks a lot for having me. And you can find my YouTube channel, which is Darwin and Jesus, if you just search that up. And also, I'm primarily over at X, and you can just find me over there at Darwin to Jesus, like my name is displayed here. So, if y'all want to come and check out what I'm doing at those two places, I'd love to talk to you more.
Yes. So thank you all for watching. If you made it this far, do all the YouTube stuff, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and hopefully we'll see you guys in the next one. Take care.